Well, hello. My name is Angel Wood, and this is Crime of the Truest Kind. And I think we got a new theme song. Well, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for checking in. If you've returned because you've been waiting for new episodes, thank you for your patience. If you are brand new here, well, welcome. I talk about New England crime stories, things that happened here, things that happened to the people here. This is a special episode because this crime did not happen in New England, but its effects run deep. And you will hear the inevitable dog noises, some from my crew, others from my guests. We hear so much about celebrity. It's an obsession, really. Magnified by 100 million due to YouTube and Instagram and TikTok. It's exhausting. Now, I'm not going to break down how damaging social media is to our psyche. Just know that the human body wasn't designed to stare at a 5-inch screen or fixate on what everyone else appears to be doing. And when a famous person dies, it becomes the lead story. It clogs the news cycle for a minute. We eulogize them in our feeds. But when a famous person is brutally murdered, well, that's when the vultures come out. Murder gets ratings, it sells papers, it gets clicks. We always seem to forget the humanity in it. I guess it's far less sexy to remember that there are actual human emotions involved. The story of Phil Hartman's death has been told and retold over the 24 years since he was killed. Yes, it was brutal and shocking. And yes, it was salacious, because it was at the hands of his wife and the mother of his 2 children. 2 children who were asleep in their beds in the early morning hours of May 28th, 1998. Phil Hartman was born in Brantford, Ontario, Canada, on September 24th, 1948. When he was 10 years old, his family moved to the States. He was the 4th of 8 children, which often leads to a lot of clowning. The Hartmans, with 2 N's, Phil dropped one, first lived in Lewiston, Maine, a lovely spot in southern Maine that sits about halfway between Augusta and Portland. And then to Meriden, Connecticut. That lies somewhere in that gray area between Red Sox Nation and the Yankee country part of the state. Now, there is nothing new to report about the story. We know what happened. What we don't know is why Bryn Hartman made that choice in those moments. She took any answers we might find with her when she died that morning. Domestic discord. That is how authorities first characterized what took place in the Hartman home that morning. Sometime after 6 a.m. local time, police responded to a 911 call placed by Bryn's friend who came to the house with her after she had told him that she'd killed Phil. That friend reported a shooting at the Encino home that Phil had lovingly nicknamed the Ponderosa. When police arrived, they found their 2 children in the house unharmed. Bryn Hartman had locked herself in the bedroom where Phil lay in the bed hours after succumbing to 3 gunshots. As they were moving the youngest child, their 6-year-old daughter, who had to have been equally confused and terrified by that time, they heard one single gunshot. They entered the primary bedroom to find Bryn laying next to Phil. According to the Los Angeles Times, they knew for sure that Bryn Hartman inflicted her own gunshot wound, and she apparently shot herself as the officers were in the house. This is according to Lieutenant Anthony Alba of the Los Angeles Police Department. Mr. Hartman had been dead for a while, he said. He did not die at the same time that Mrs. Hartman had apparently killed herself. Phil was 49 when he died. He would be 73 now. Bryn had just turned 40 years old 1 month before they died. So young, so much life left to live. She would be 64 today. Their children are grown, raised by her sister Catherine Wright and her husband Mike, who at the time of their parents' death lived in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Phil was a thoughtful man. The Hartman estate was estimated at $1.2 million, and he left it to the children with very specific directives on how the estate is to be distributed to the children starting when each turned 25. The children were just 6 and 9 years old when their parents died. Phil was the man of 1,000 voices, silenced. He was celebrated as the glue that held the shows together. Any show Phil was a part of, really. He was called low maintenance, the anti-Hollywood guy, kind and giving. He was smart, really smart, and curious. He was masterful at so much, except for his most personal relationships. That's where he struggled. Phil discovered improv comedy in the 70s while at a show at the famous Groundlings in LA. He met and became good friends with Paul Reubens, also known as Pee Wee Herman, and helped create Pee Wee's character. They worked on the show, The Pee Wee Herman Show, and he co-wrote Pee Wee's Big Adventure. It came at a good time for Phil. He was in his mid-30s by then and becoming disillusioned with acting. It wasn't until 1986 when he auditioned for Saturday Night Live. And you can see that audition on YouTube. He got the show and was very important in pulling it out of its stagnation. He is, by all accounts, a beloved member of the team of writers and performers. In 1991, he was cast in The Simpsons as the voice of Troy McClure.
Hello, I'm Troy McClure. You may remember me from such movies as Smoke Yourself Thin and Get Confident, Stupid, Alien Nose Job, and 5 Fabulous Weeks of the Chevy Chase Show.
He's also the voice of Lionel Hutz, the lecherous lawyer to Bart Simpson. While his professional life took off, he struggled in his personal life. By this time, he was in his 3rd marriage. He and Bryn had gotten married in 1987, and they had 2 children, a son, born in 1989, and a daughter in 1992. He adored his family, and despite all the problems he and Bryn faced, he was dedicated to keeping his family together. As difficult as it was at times, Bryn and Phil's relationship was very difficult. Despite his success, Bryn was unhappy about it because she wanted some of her own. Bryn seemed resentful of his work, his schedule, and it was pretty clear to those in his orbit that there were problems in their relationship. This isn't a show about that, though. I want to talk about how he lived, because we know how he died. My guest is a friend and a colleague. We worked together at a very well-known radio station in Boston, WFNX, where we did a morning radio show. He was Brian the Pharmacist of Jackson and the Pharmacist fame. That was also in the early 2000s, so we go way, way back. Brian Mulhern is the morning host now at Cat Country 98.1 in Providence, Rhode Island. He is a native New Englander like myself and is a friend and colleague of the late Phil Hartman. Phil Hartman hired Brian and his brother Kevin, also in radio at Providence rock station WHJY, to write a TV show. Now, Brian and I have been talking about doing this episode for a very long time, so I thank him for helping make it happen. So yes, this is a very special episode. I will let Brian tell you the story. We play a little catch-up. Okay, a lot of catch-up, but I spared you and I removed a lot of that. You will hear rerun Brian's Beagle. I left him in. Dogs are always welcome here.
Please welcome Phil Hartman. Mr. Phil Hartman, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome one of TV's funniest stars, Phil Hartman. Phil! You want a light for your cigarette? I know I'm a non-smoker, Dave.
I started this true crime podcast during COVID. It was something I always wanted to do. I never had time to do it. And I decided, I remember exactly the time and place when I decided I'm going to do this. I was reading a book that my friend Dave Wedge wrote about Whitey Bulger. Hunting Whitey Bulger, it's called. It was so good. I was so inspired by it. I'm like, I'm going to do a podcast, and my first episode is going to be Whitey Bulger. And then that morphed into being a New England-driven podcast. People were receptive to it. I started to get great reviews. People come up to me when I see them. They're like, oh my God, I love your podcast.
Oh, wow.
I went to Crime Con in Vegas.
I think I saw that on socials. Yeah.
It was bananas. Paul, my husband, went with me because he's wonderful. Not his thing at all. He'd be like, can we watch something that's not a murder show tonight? He went with me, and one of his pals called, and we were walking through the hallway, and we're like lining up to buy a book or something. I don't know. And his pal called, and he's like, I'm at Crime Con. It's like Lilith Fair for murder. And I'm like, you're not wrong. It was just women.
That's the first time those two concepts have been combined, I'm certain.
It's a sea of women, and then along with that comes all of the psychology of it. Like, why do women love true crime? Because we're the victims of true crime, by and large. It's us that's going to get kills. But people are really receptive to it. And I said all that to say, when I took that job, I was like, I'm going to take a short hiatus and come back and do the show. I didn't have time to do anything. I was just consumed by that job. That was one of the biggest reasons why I left the job. And I really thought, okay, I'll be able to transition into this new gig, and then I can pick up the true crime podcast again. And I wasn't able to because I was so busy. I really want to do the show again. And what really makes it, I'll say, easier is to have an interview with somebody. My approach to this is, and it has to be this way, and I didn't know this getting into it. I had absolutely no idea how this would morph. But I learned pretty fast that it has to be about compassion. It has to be about, there are families, living, breathing families that have to deal with this every single day. They should not have people knocking on the door asking them about the worst day of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have compassion, and you should research, you should read about it, and you should talk to people who knew the person.
Mm-hmm.
So, somebody like Phil Hartman, who is revered, and I think has really resonated still all these years later with comedy fans. These years later, so many years later, people are still like, oh my God, they know his voices and they know the lines. And
mm-hmm.
It's sad to think that it's been almost 25 years that he's been gone. And I actually did the math. He'd be 74 this year.
Yeah, it's mind blowing. And the weird thing is too, when I turned 49, I was just like, for the rest of my life, these are all the years he didn't live.
That's right.
Just so
that's right.
That bothers me to some degree too, because I'm feeling older and older. I don't know how it's been for you, what your experience has been like. For the longest time, I'm like, I don't really feel that old. But last couple of years, I'm like, yeah, I'm kind of starting to feel a little.
Yeah, I'm with you. And how do you not have? I now have progressive lenses, which I finally went for it. I did readers forever, and I got totally annoyed with having to pull up. Oh, you did it.
Readers, that's it.
Yeah.
But these are 1.5s. And it's funny because I had amazing eyesight for my whole life, and my dad did too. And he said to me, when you turn 50, he's like, get ready, because that's when it's going to start. And I literally, when I was 49, one day I was trying to read something. I'm like, oh no. The thing with Phil is that I always think, I'm like, here are these years that to me, in some ways, when I look at it that way, they're kind of this gift that he never got. But I just always, the thing that always bothered me the most about him is, how much more could he have done? And I remember Stern saying this, and again, what an Eddie Van Halen fan I am.
Oh yeah.
Stern said the same thing, the same thought that I had very shortly after Phil died. Like, this was a guy who could do so many. He was truly a Renaissance man. I mean, he was a pilot. He could play guitar. He had interest in like photography, voices and funny and acting and all these other things that he could do, just all these crazy interests, and spent a lifetime just building and finessing and accruing this talent. And then in a second, all that energy is gone, like all that knowledge, all of those things. And
Yeah.
it's, and I'm just like, never mind being personally devastated by the whole thing,
Mm-hmm.
but just to have that taken away from you. Like, even I still, like, on the weekends, I'll sit here to listen to Van Halen and cry and be like, I'm never going to see them live again. I'm never going to get the new music and all that stuff. And it's just like, I mean, they're like, oh, well, he lives on through his music forever. Like, yeah. And yeah, I can watch old Phil stuff, but oh man, what else could they have done? That's the killer.
I think about that, watching I mean, I've always been an SNL fan, and I still am to this day. And I love every year I'm always excited to see who the new players are they're going to add. Like this year, there are, 3 cast members left. I'm like, who's next? Who's going to be the next,
Is this going to be a horrible year, or are we going to get the next, like, Will Ferrell or Kate McKinnon or whatever? Yeah.
And, going back to when Phil started, I definitely want to back up and talk a bit about, your relationship and how you came to know one another, and your working relationship and your personal and all of those things. But Phil should be, if he's not, and I'm sure that this conversation comes up a lot when people talk about Phil, he saved SNL, because the year that he came on board, it was tanking miserably.
What ended up happening was they did that, Lauren had left. They did that all-star year, which is a lot of people considered, and I actually do consider it to be one of the best years of SNL ever. Martin Short, Christopher Guest, Harry Shearer. I don't know if Julia Louis-Dreyfus was still on at that time, but it was just like this all-star cast, and it was a great year. And the year after that, Lauren came back, and it was Anthony Michael Hall. It was Robert Downey Jr. He had hired Lovitz, but it was just, the cast just did not gel at all. And I think a lot of people kind of thought like, yeah, that was going to be the end of it. But then that next year, they brought in Carvey, they brought in Phil, Kevin Nealon, and Lovitz, who's Phil's best friend, was already there. Lovitz helped to get him on the show, and then it exploded again. Prior to that one year in '84, where it kind of came back a little bit. I mean, they had that Eddie Murphy boost there for a little while, and it just kind of, after Lauren left, it flattened out again. But yeah, I do think it was on the verge of kind of teetering on the precipice. And that cast definitely brought it back. Jan Hooks, who was amazing, was part of that cast too. Came in that year. Nora Dunn, Victoria Jackson, Dennis Miller. I don't know if Dennis Miller might have been there the year before, but yeah. No, obviously that's my favorite cast of all time. But
they call him the glue, because he
held everything together.
He held it together, and he was comfortable. He was a lot of things, but he had such amazing talent, but such humility at the same time. He was okay being sort of a background player for a lot of those other folks who he truly did love on that cast.
Well, and a lot of them appreciated him for that. He didn't necessarily have to get the laugh. And I know he had a lot of respect for Aykroyd, because a lot of people looked at Dan Aykroyd in that way. And a lot of people would say, too, going back to old school comedy, Abbott and Costello, that Bud Abbott had the much more difficult job. It is so difficult to step back and let somebody else, to set somebody up on that level and let somebody else get all the laughs and be the one that everybody loves. But writers, like, literally at that time, sometimes cast members would get upset because they would want him in everything. And it's a very competitive environment there in terms of whether you're on the show or whether you're not, and how much you're on the show every week. And the only resentment of him at the show, I mean, he had some issues, and I can tell you some stories about that. He was one of the only cast members. Cast members write stuff for themselves too, and work with other writers. On that cast, he was the only one who was getting paid as a writer and a performer, and they were upset that he was getting paid for both at the time. And that, I remember, that was a little bit of an issue. But outside of that, and outside of him getting stabbed in the back by one person in particular who now says he regrets it, Rob Schneider.
Oh, yeah.
Was trying to undercut a lot of what Phil was doing. He was universally loved. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Sandler who called him the glue the first time, and it stuck. The very last show that he did the thing with Farley where they're on the stage saying goodbye.
Yeah.
He's done that musical thing, Auf Wiedersehen, goodbye, that whole thing. He walks backstage and everyone is crying and applauding, and they handed him on a piece of balsa wood a bottle of glue attached to it. And they said you would have thought that he had won the Oscar. Like, it meant so much to him that they revered him in that way and thought of him in that way. And just like that little gesture, he completely lost it.
He's just so capable. When you watch him perform, you know, when you watch those early things, like, for example, his audition, his SNL audition, he has that fire and that energy similar to the magic that Robin Williams always had. There was just a way where he just seamlessly could transition into accents and characters, and he made it look so easy. For him, maybe it was. He made it look so easy, but it was just like out of this world. It was just inhuman how the level of talent and just, I don't know, preparation that had to go in to this rapid fire performance that he gave.
Well, I do think, you know, he was born with a gift, and I think people who are geniuses, they're wired a certain way. You know, I could play the guitar for the next 20 years straight, and I'll never be Eddie Van Halen, you know? And believe me, I wanted to be Eddie Van Halen, and I tried, but there was just a point where I hit a plateau, and I was like, I can't, I'm not going to get any better. I think the interesting thing with Phil is he did have that gift, and I think this was also a blessing. His success came to him so late, whereas Eddie Murphy hits SNL at the age of 19 and just takes off like a rocket ship. And I think because he got there later, he appreciated it more. He had always told me a story too, how he came up in the Groundlings, the improv troupe out in Los Angeles, with the likes of Paul Rubens, Pee Wee Herman, and they became very friendly. And Pee Wee's career took off. Lovitz leaves the Groundlings. He's doing his thing. Pee Wee gets a chance, Rubens, to write Pee Wee's Big Adventure, and he invites Phil along, and he got a nice little paycheck for himself. And he said, at that point, I just kind of had given up on acting. He said, I thought, well, this is a bad way to make a living. If I have to be a writer for the rest of my life and write screenplays, that's not the worst thing in the world. And he told me a story one time. He said, something interesting happened when I came to that place, because at that moment, I would walk into auditions and the air of desperation was gone. And I was just like, whether I get this or not, like, who cares? And I think that comes with maturity, and it also comes with, I've got nothing to lose and letting it go. And that's why I think at that point, with all of those things in play, that's where he had that comfort. Now, notoriously, initially, some people would say that his SNL audition at first wasn't going that well, and Lovitz was there and sensed that it didn't start as well.
Jumped in.
He did. And the funny thing is, Lovitz went into Lorne's office while he was at SNL, Phil wasn't, and was begging Lorne to hire Phil. And he literally said, he's funnier than I am. Like, you know, this is a sin that you are not bringing him on the show. And Lorne's attitude was, oh, this is a guy in his 30s. He's still at the Groundlings. I mean, there's red flags when it comes to a situation like that. But so Lovitz jumps in and does this now famous sketch, which they did at the Groundlings, and they ended up doing on SNL, I think within Phil's first season, where he's a washed up 1940s actor, and they do that 1940 speak back and forth. And that was, Lovitz jumping in was such an amazing display of friendship that completely put Phil's audition over the top. And a lot of people feel like it was that moment where people thought, all right, well, this guy's really got something going on here. But if you watch that audition, and it's online, he seems like he's fumbling around a little bit, and you can see the nerves and stuff, but as soon as Lovitz jumps in, it's a different story. But he also told me this amazing story about when he was at the Groundlings. And have you ever been to one of their shows?
I have not.
It's one of those things. I'm friendly with Will Forte. We kind of came up together at the same time in the writing world, and I used to go watch him at the Groundlings. And there's nights where it's packed, and there's nights when there's like 3 people there, and you just kind of have to figure it out regardless of what the room's like. So Phil's up there. It's one of those nights where there's 3 people, and he looks down into the audience, and one of the people is Jack Lemmon. So he said to himself, well, I really got to bring my A game, and I got to play the room like it's completely packed. So he said, I did my show, felt pretty good about it, went back to the dressing room, and there's a knock at the door, and I open it, and it's Jack Lemmon. And Lemmon walks in, and he says, look, I don't want to take a lot of your time, he said, but what I saw out there tonight was pretty amazing. And I know you're of a certain age, and I can tell that you've been at this for quite some time. And I have no doubt in my mind that there are moments where you're asking, what am I doing, and should I keep doing this? And he said, I am a huge fan of talent, so I'm telling you, you got to keep doing this. He said, but you have to do me a favor. In the future, when you see somebody in your position and you recognize talent, I want you to do for them what I just did for you. And my favorite Phil Hartman story was he told me that story, and then he said to me, he said, you're that person.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. I'm getting goosebumps now.
That's what a thing. What a gift.
But what a gift from Lemmon too, to take the time to do that to him. And
what a gift.
I think that's another display and demonstration of, by the time he got there, even though it was late in the game, he was ready.
But it's so not Hollywood. You know what I mean?
No.
Like that's humanity speaking. That's not Hollywood. Hollywood just bulldoze right the fuck over you, That's incredible. And that speaks to the person that Phil Hartman was. Let's talk about this, Brian Mulhern, superstar radio DJ, Providence, Rhode Island. How did it all begin? How did your relationship with Phil Hartman begin?
I learned this lesson very early on. The biggest moments in your life happen when you least expect them. We do all of this preparation. We try to be in the right place at the right time. We do all of this work, and life is not on your schedule in terms of when you're going to have that moment. And you mentioned my radio career. I didn't go to school for radio. One day I'm driving home from a job that I hate. I'm 22 years old, and this DJ comes on, who I used to listen to her in high school. She's like, I'm back. I'm on in the afternoons. I'm looking for somebody who's funny, somebody who has an interest in sports, maybe. If you want to come in and maybe intern, I don't know. And I was out of college at that point. And I was like, all right. So at that point, I had written freelance monologue material for Jay Leno's Tonight Show fill-ins for Johnny Carson. This was really aging myself. And that was the only thing I had on my resume that was show business related. And I got that through another guy who kind of taught me how to write jokes. And he's like, I think you're pretty good. You should send some stuff into Leno. And so Leno ended up calling me at my parents' house because I was living at home at the time. And I sold him a joke on the Tonight Show. I don't even know what it was. I got the check in the mail one day. So I hear this woman on the radio. And so I send her my little resume, and I had done some public access television. And my brother and I, when we were growing up, my parents had bought a camcorder, and he and I, along with a friend of ours, used to shoot video comedy sketches, and we would show them to our friends, and our friends loved them so much that we ended up putting out an anniversary special every year of all of the best ofs. This is how things went viral in 1989. And so we would make copies for our friends, and they would all watch them, and it grew this like big cult following. And God forbid if there's any of them still floating out there, because there's a lot of really bad comedy on those. But so essentially, I started all that to say this. I never expected to be sitting in the car. And what if I wasn't in the car at this moment where this woman says, I'm looking for somebody for radio? And I had no aspirations to do radio whatsoever, but I sent her the fact that I had written for Leno, and I sent her some of these sketches that I did. And then she called me a couple of days later, and she's like, is this true about Leno? I said, yeah. She said, why don't you come in tomorrow, and I'll have you answer the phones and stuff, and then I'll have you write some bits, and I'll pay you $50 a bit. And 30 years later, I'm in radio. And I very often think, what if I hadn't put her on at that exact moment? Like,
it's like sliding doors, right?
I always use that example, that movie.
Yeah.
And that's a great example, and I use that all the time. I have to give a talk to some teens at a workshop tomorrow, and I guarantee you I'm going to bring that up. So now, 30 years later, I'm still doing the radio thing, but off of that, one night, and at that point, I'm working 3 jobs. I'm kind of doing the radio thing on the side. I'm working at a pharmacy as a pharmacy technician. I'm working for another company that was pharmaceutical related. Not that I had any.
Brian the pharmacist.
Brian the pharmacist, which was my radio name.
Came from.
Given to me by the woman who I was listening to at the time, because on my resume I said I'm a pharmacy technician. She's like, well, you're Brian the pharmacist now. Everybody always thought it was like this big drug reference, and there's nobody more lame on planet Earth than yours truly when it comes to that kind of thing. I can get you some blood pressure medication at this point, maybe cholesterol, but no oxys or anything of that nature. But anyway, so I'm in the middle of this, still trying to figure my life out, and I'm a huge Letterman fan, and that was the guy who got me into wanting to do comedy and maybe even broadcasting to a certain extent. So I'm watching Letterman one night, and he has Phil Hartman on as a guest, and I'm an enormous fan of Phil's.
Yeah.
And so he's talking to Dave about how he's in his last season at SNL, and that he's going to be shooting a pilot for NBC called The Phil Show. And it was going to be an NBC primetime thing, completely revolving around him, sketch variety, not dissimilar to SNL and some of the things he did there. And there was talk about every week he'd come out hosting as a different character or whatever. And he said, but I've been out in LA and I've been looking for writers, and still kind of in the process of that. And it's moving really slowly. So in that sliding door moment, I said to myself, I'm just going to send a packet to 30 Rock, Phil Hartman, care of SNL. I'll put in some of my goofy videotape stuff that I have. I'll send some scripts that I've written for sketches. I'll send some of my radio bits. About 3 days later, I'm working at the pharmacy, and the phone rings, and I pick it up, and it's both of my parents on the phone at the same time. And I remember my dad saying, wow. And I said, what's going on? He said, somebody just called looking for you from Saturday Night Live. I think his name is Peter. And I said, was it Phil Hartman? And my dad said, yeah. He wants you to call him tomorrow. He wants to talk to you about whatever it was that you sent him. So I'm just like, oh my God. I hang up the phone. I don't sleep a wink the entire night. And I'm running every scenario in my head. Is this going to be the kind of thing like, hey, thanks for sending it. Not really interested, but just wanted to say that, keep plugging. I think you got some decent stuff here. Or maybe he's going to tell me that it's horrible. I'd heard all the Hollywood stories and everything. Or maybe there's really an opportunity here. So I'm sitting and I'm waiting, and I call the number, get him in his dressing room. And he said, yeah, he goes, I just looked at everything that you wrote. And you mentioned you have a brother, and your brother helps you with this stuff. I said, yeah. He said, I want you guys to both come out to Saturday Night Live next week, and I want you guys to start seeing how we do what we do here.
Wow.
He said, because he's like, there's some great stuff here, and I want to get this process going. And as he later said, off of that Letterman thing, he received, it was like hundreds or thousands of submissions. And he said, and I picked 3 people out of that, and 2 of them were Mulherns. And that's how it started. That just randomly, and believe me, I had sent crap out to a million people and just never heard anything back or had it sent back unopened. But I was just so determined. And for it to end up being Phil Hartman, who, I mean, I already had immense respect for him. And then to discover not only how talented is, I hate using the past tense about him, but just what a sweetheart of a man. The sweetest, kindest soul, so supportive. And I mean, if there are three people that I owe my entire career to in terms of they were working professionally and they took a chance, it was Leno, it was Carolyn Fox, who was the woman who was on the radio, and it's Phil Hartman. And that's around these parts, that's some pretty good company to be in.
Yeah, that's some bragging rights right there.
It was just like one of those things where I would pinch myself, and he was so humble and he so couldn't take a compliment. And I just remember a specific time early on in our relationship where I was just like, look, I don't want to embarrass you or anything, but I'm like, do you have any idea what this means to me?
Yeah.
You believe in me on any level? I said, and he just would not even want to go down that road or talk about how great he was or anything like that. And as a matter of fact, that also just jogged my memory. His first season on news radio, when the Phil show, we worked on that for a year. This was my first lesson in Hollywood.
Now, did you move out there? Did you and Kevin move out to Hollywood to write?
Within a week of moving out there to go live with him and his wife, Bryn, until we got situated. Yeah. And NBC pulled the plug on it because, and the story behind that is, so we're working on this for a year. And the way that we were doing it was, this is before the internet. This is before emails and things. So he had a FedEx account, and we would FedEx stuff back and forth as we were writing the pilot. And then we're putting the staff together. And one of the people who was under consideration at the time for head writer was Kevin McDonald from Kids in the Hall.
Yeah.
There was this producer that got involved, Joel Gallen, who, I'm a Rhode Island guy. He happened to go to the University of Rhode Island. We got really friendly with him. And we're doing all this work on the show. We get to within a week of doing it. And at the same time, they had offered something similar to Martin Short. And Martin Short was getting his own hour-long sketch variety thing. And Jan Hooks from SNL was also involved in that show. Well, they got a little bit of a head start on us. And his pilot aired first. And one of the problems that Marty, if I may call him that, had
I'll allow it
with the network. I won't call him a teen. I do know not to say that. It was one of these things where, and Phil started experiencing this too. We started getting notes where NBC started asking themselves, can sketch variety be a thing? I mean, this hasn't really worked since Carol Burnett, and Friends had just started to take off for the network. So then they were like, well, should we make it more of a combination of a sitcom and a sketch show? And then once the suits get involved, non-comedy people making comedy decisions, that first episode of Martin Short Show was such a mess. And you've really got to mess something up to make Martin Short look like he's not doing something that's perfect. Because I mean, he's one of the funniest people in the universe. But somehow they managed to do it. And it ended up being such an unmitigated disaster. It lasted for one episode. They pulled the plug on him, and then they pulled the plug on us as we were a week away from moving out there to get going on shooting the pilot. But I'll never forget to show you what kind of person he was. And he felt so horribly about the whole thing. The next thing that he did was he picked up a phone and he called my mom. And he had become very friendly with my mom. He would call to talk to my brother, Kevin, or myself. And if we weren't there, he'd talk to my mom for 90 minutes. He was just that kind of guy. And my mom adored him. So he said, Barbara, I just want to call and let you know that this is a very tough business. And he said, I've experienced this kind of thing 1,000,000 times. I'll experience it another 1,000,000 times. He said, but I love those kids. And as a parent, I wanted to personally call you and apologize to you for having to pick up the pieces from this whole thing. These guys are going to be fine. They're talented guys. Don't worry about them. And I'll always have their back, and I'll get them in a good situation. but that was the kind of guy he was. And my mom told me, she said when she wrapped up with him, the last thing she said on that call, she said, "You're a good man, Phil Hartman." And again, he felt really uncomfortable with the compliment, but a lot of times when I think of him, that's the line that I think about. That's kind of, it's inscribed on my heart. You're a good man, Phil Hartman. And
That's a good title for something you could write about him. You're a good man, Phil Hartman.
We've been down that road as well. We've already gone down that road.
So talk to me about what came after you maintained a friendship throughout. What was the time period that you were developing this show?
Phil called me in November of 1993.
Okay.
And then we worked on it well into 94. I think the plug got pulled. It was close to a year that we had been working on it. So maybe in the fall of 94. Mm-hmm. And so then after that, the next move was going to be, how about I try to get you guys into SNL? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, yeah, I wouldn't have a problem with that. Yep. So we started sending submissions there, and then something terrible happened that he didn't see coming, but I think ended up maybe causing some problems for us. On a Saturday morning, he's asleep and he gets a phone call, and it's this guy on the other end. He said, "Hi, Mr. Hartman, I'm so-and-so from TV Guide, and I'm writing an article about Saturday Night Live and how in the absence of you and the likes of Dana Carvey having moved on, and the show's just not doing well and the ratings are horrible, and what's your take on that?" Now, he just was completely ambushed by this, didn't really have anything prepared. So he said, "Well, the one thing I will say about what had happened on the show when I was there with Dana and with Jan Hooks, I would say that there were a lot of layers to what we did, where we could do different characters, we could do impressions, we were very good at improvising." And he said, "Whereas I would say about this cast, Adam Sandler just does that goofy voice. Chris Farley's just playing the fat guy, you know what I mean? David Spade is kind of the smarmy, sarcastic. So he's like not as layered. He's like very funny, but not as layered." Well, the guy took that and turned it into, twisted words around and made it sound like Phil had said, these guys aren't as talented as Dana and Jan and myself. Mm-hmm. And Lorne was furious. And for as much as Phil tried to go back and be like, "Lorne, obviously I would never say anything to hurt the show." And Phil adored those guys, and as Farley especially, Farley, he was somebody who he was very worried about for obvious reasons, and so he was heartbroken over that, and that I think kind of pulled the plug, because at that point they weren't really in the Phil Hartman business. And as a matter of fact, I think he only hosted the show twice, the last time in 96, but it took and he would seem like such an obvious choice to go back and host, but some wounds had to heal from that before that even ended up happening. I think it was a couple of years before he went on the first time. So, that was the next step. And then after that, he and I, he still wanted to do something and still had a good relationship with NBC. And he went on to News Radio, which was already staffed. Paul Sims created that and had plenty of writers. And so he really couldn't get us in there. And we'd done more sketch stuff. We really hadn't done episodic television. So he wanted to do an hour-long special for NBC. So he and I worked on writing a special together for a while, and nothing really ever came of that. But we just kept working on little side projects like that. And then even to the extent up till when he passed away in 1998, at the time, he and I were working on a movie together, and we had pitched to a company that I don't even know if they're still in existence. It's called the Shooting Gallery. They were probably best known for Sling Blade, the Billy Bob Thornton thing. And very well done. And at the time, I had come up with an idea. I had seen Waiting for Guffman, the Christopher Guest movie, and I just love Christopher Guest, and I love the mockumentary style. And at that time, Jerry Springer was huge on TV, and I came up with this idea that Phil was somebody who was a serious newscaster / broadcaster who kind of fell from grace, had a very publicly embarrassing thing happen to him, tried to get back into the news business, couldn't do it. But the only opportunity he got was to do this kind of show. But if that was the thing that could keep him in TV, that would be good enough. And maybe he could prove himself enough to get to the point where he could be taken seriously as a journalist again, which of course is absurd because you're doing that kind of show. That's never going to happen.
Because that's what happened with, I don't know, Maury Povich.
Yeah, exactly. So it was just this silly idea that I had, and how he was always trying to raise the bar on the show, and the syndicator and the producer, and nobody wanted anything to do with any of that. So it was that constant battle and that push and pull. So the night before he was murdered, I had sent him my first 20 pages, and he called me at home and he said, I got the stuff. He said, it looks amazing. Just keep doing what you're doing. And he was in a really good mood. He said, hey, and they didn't know if it was going to happen or not. I believe it was like maybe the 4th season of News Radio. He's like, we just got picked up. I found out yesterday. He said, I'm so excited. Bryn, the kids and I are getting ready to go to a beach house. I think he used to rent like Brian Wilson's beach house or something. Here's the phone number there if you need anything. And so then he said, what's going on with you? You sound a little off. And I said, I'm just getting a little bit frustrated with my career right now, because I was trying to decide whether I should keep pursuing the TV thing, or I was getting, my radio career had made some strides. I'm working on these side things with Phil, and some of those things were making progress. Some things were going nowhere. And he just said to me, he's like, look, first of all, Brian, I'm old enough to know that all of that stuff isn't what's important. What's important is your family. He's like, you've got a great one, your friends. He's like, you've got all the talent in the world. This is not something that you should be worried about. He's like, look at me.
Yeah.
It took a long time for me to get here, but I'm 49 years old. I've got this great career. I've got 2 beautiful kids, an awesome wife. My show just got picked up. I'm going to a beach house. He's like, and you're going to get there. He's like, I'm not worried about it. And it was just such this great pep talk. And it was so good to hear him so happy, because it was a complicated marriage between the two of them. And I was privy to some of the things that were going on.
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to ask you. Like, were you aware of the stressors that were happening in that relationship? Because I know it was very, like you say, very layered. It was very complicated. Some people might even call it a toxic relationship, subsequent, to what we've learned. What did you know?
I knew that it was up and down. I knew there were issues. I knew that there was some kind of substance abuse going on. I didn't know specifically what it was.
Yeah.
But there would be times when things seemed great, and there'd be other times that they didn't seem great. And the one thing that I will say that I picked up on was, and I didn't know her well, but I was never particularly impressed with her in that she was, for as nice as he always was to me, she just wasn't really that nice to me or my brother. And anytime that I would call, like, she wouldn't give him messages. And I'll never forget, I told you about how close he got to my mom, and he only had a phone relationship with her. So I think it was in 1995, he said, I'm going to be on Letterman on your mom's birthday. And I want you and your brother to take your mom to New York so we can all go out to dinner and I can finally meet her. And that's the birthday gift that I want to give to her. So she was just so thrilled and so excited. And we got there and we saw him on the show. He absolutely killed. But in the middle of that, he got in touch with me. I can't even remember how. And he said, look, I'm sorry, we can't do the dinner tonight. And he's like, and I hate to do this to you guys, but he told me this actually before the show. Bryn doesn't want to stick around. She wants to leave after my segment is over. And I think a lot of times too, I don't want to say he was afraid of her or whatever, but he just didn't like conflict. And I never forgave Bryn for that because my mom never met Phil. And like that was her one chance to do it. But there just seemed to be a lot of kind of passive aggressive stuff like that with Bryn and my brother and myself. And in retrospect, and one of the other things that I really noticed about that relationship that I picked up on very early on in the process of the Phil show was the fact that he was adamant that she had to be on the show, that she had to be an actress on the show.
Yeah. He tried with her pressuring. He did try, maybe sometimes half-heartedly, but he did try to get roles for her. He did try to, I understand that she had written something once that he tried to pass on to someone along the lines. And
it wasn't half-hearted when it came to the Phil show. He was adamant. And my brother and I,
because he had more control at that point.
Oh yeah.
Right.
And he probably felt like, this is how I'm going to finally get this albatross off my back. There is this famous story about the opening credits of SNL, one of the seasons, where they're sitting at the table together.
Yes.
And that was one way they said, look, I can, this is a way I can get you on SNL.
Yeah.
And so when you see it, it's Phil looking to the camera and you see the back of her head and her earring swinging. And the reason that is because she kept trying to look at the camera and the director was saying, no, look at him. Don't look at the camera. And she was so upset about that. And I know he caught some crap for that. And she complained to friends about it. So when he had the opportunity for her, and I immediately asked him, I said, is she funny? And he said, well, in her own way. And right away, I'm like, oh, God, I don't know how this is going to go. But he's the boss. But I also remember saying at the time, and I hope this is okay for me to reveal this, and if you don't think it is, feel free to edit it out. We were pushing for Jan Hooks before she had signed on to the Martin Short show. Yeah. And he said, I'm going to tell you a couple of things about Jan Hooks. You would never know it to see her, but I have never met anyone in my life with stage fright on the level that Jan Hooks has, to the extent that we would be getting ready to do a sketch on SNL and she's backstage vomiting. Wow. Because she has so much anxiety. And he said, and one thing leads to another off of that whole thing. Long story short, I don't know that I want to babysit a cocaine problem. And when I look back at that now, what I know about Bryn, and I'm like, you don't want to babysit that cocaine problem.
That's right.
But you've got this whole other thing going on here. So it was just, it was a weird relationship. I mean, he did love her. He adored her. He adored the kids. And, but I really do think that she resented his success and by extension,
very much
resented the attention that he was paying to my brother and myself. So she started to kind of resent us through osmosis, and I think just kept trying to cut us off at the knees to stick it to two 20-something-year-old kids and their poor mom. The one thing I can say is that, you know, I knew they were having ups and downs. I never really tried to say too much. You don't want to speak poorly of somebody's spouse. I just tried to listen to him when they were having problems, and I never complained to him about her, but I knew that there was some kind of a funky dynamic going on there. And I think I was too young to really be able to put my finger on it.
I listened to Joe Rogan, actually, who I'm not I'm not really a fan of, but I know that he was there and he was very much a part of the news radio team. And he said he was doing an interview with Tom Papa, and they got on the subject of Phil. And he said wonderful things about Phil, as everyone does, about how smart Phil was and how well read he was. And, you know, he was a pilot and he was all of these things. And, you know, during off time on news radio, he'd be reading aviation books, and he was just so smart and just wanted to know so many things. And I remember he said about Bryn and Phil's relationship that Bryn was actually pretty mean to Phil. And it seemed as though, through everything that I've read and all the research I've done up until now, is that she was just very resentful of the success that he had. And I don't really understand that as someone who, you know, have a partner. My partner has I knew what my partner was about when I met him. I knew he was a musician. I always liked that about him. And I don't understand those relationships where as soon as you're with someone, you want that person to stop all of those things that you initially liked about them.
Well, I think part and parcel was the fact that she moved to Los Angeles from Minnesota with aspirations
Vicky
of becoming, yes, Vicky Joe, Omdahl, with aspirations of becoming actress, model, whatever. Like that's why she was there.
That's right.
So she had her sights set on that. And, you know, when she got introduced to Phil at a party, he had already had some of his success. And I think she saw that as an opportunity. And that's not to say that, you know, I don't think that she didn't love him or whatever. I really and truly think that she did. But I think she also early on saw that as an opportunity that maybe this would kick some doors open for me. But as the relationship progressed and evolved, and suddenly now they have 2 kids, and now he's off shooting movies. She's stuck at home raising them. She's feeling neglected. She's feeling like the career is becoming more of a priority. He feels as if, you know, he needs to be the breadwinner, and there's not really a whole heck of a lot going on with her career-wise, you know, even though she made attempts and she did try to write, and she was in the movie North very briefly as basically an extra, but never really got steady work as an actress either.
Yeah.
I think that's how the resentment built. And I also think too that, you know, and rightfully so, he was just so revered and so talented. And you mentioned all of the things that he did. This guy was a Renaissance man, and he was so good at everything. Like I never saw him suck at anything. But I really also believe too, for as humble as he was, I think he felt like that he could do almost anything. Maybe even that extended to the marriage and maybe trying to fix her. And that was the one instance in which he just did not have the ability to harness that. And I don't ever think in a million years that she had any intention of murdering him.
No,
I think that was a drug-filled haze, a very angry night. And if she could undo it, I'm sure that she would. And I wish that she could, but she can't. It was a complicated relationship. Career meant a lot to her. By all accounts, she was a wonderful mom.
And identity meant something to her, and she didn't ever feel like she had one other than being someone's wife and someone's mother. And yes, by all accounts, let's lay that out. By all accounts, she was said to be a wonderful mother to her children.
Yes. And I never saw any evidence contrary to that either. And I will say that. And there were stretches too where she would be clean and things would go great. And you could tell by his mood, and not that he was such a positive guy, and he would never let that wall down. He would never want people to think that he was struggling or needed help. But I do know too, speaking of news radio, Vicki Lewis, who was on the show at the time, was dating Nick Nolte, who is a bit of a handful himself, as you can imagine. And she and Phil at the time would commiserate about their troubled relationships and kind of be a shoulder for each other to cry on, and could relate to each other when, you know, Nick would go off the deep end and when Bryn would go off the deep end. So they were very simpatico in that way.
It would seem, you know, Phil Hartman had 3 marriages. It would seem that he never found the right personality that would match the awesomeness, the presence that he had. It seems like all of the women that he had been with, he truly loved at the time. And then because of, I don't know, something that happened in, I don't know, maybe his childhood or whatever, he just drifted away from those relationships. And I think that's really why he tried to work hard with his relationship with his 3rd wife, Bryn. He saw that those relationships fell apart. And I think he really, at his age, and then he had children, he really wanted to work hard at it, even though it had to have been extremely difficult for him to manage a personality like that.
Well, I think, and a lot of people have said this, I think he was in love with the idea of being in love, and he was very romantic. But I think this kind of plays into something I said earlier, where A, not good at taking a compliment, B, not real good with confrontation. And when you combine some of that, and look, we're both married, not to each other, to other people, but you know, it's work. And
Yeah.
sometimes you got to have the uncomfortable conversation. And if you're with somebody who doesn't want to have the uncomfortable conversation, I specifically remember he had said to me at one point when he was having problems, how he was reading Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And he said, there's some really interesting stuff in this book that I'm learning about. And he was explaining to me how men tend to retreat into their caves. And whenever they were having problems emotionally, in some ways, he would do that. And he said to me, the problem is when I go into my cave, she starts throwing hand grenades into it to try to get me back out.
Yeah.
And that was when I really had a peek into, wow, we've really got some problems here. I also want to mention, too, I think to some degree, I don't think he ever stopped loving his second wife. And there was, at one point, he said to Bryn, and Bryn hated her and sent her a note.
Yeah.
I'm sure you read about the letter that she sent, where she sent a note congratulating the two of them. And Bryn wrote her back something that was just so vile.
She really showed her hands. And that's disturbing.
Yeah. And the second wife, contacted Phil and told her what Bryn had done. And Phil laughed it off and said, you should have seen the note that she wanted to send. Like he had gone in and made her rewrite it.
That's
but
right.
The fact that he was okay with Bryn doing that, just kind of enabling this mania, I think is another peek into how that marriage wasn't particularly healthy. And I think what really set Bryn off was at one point, allegedly he had said to Bryn that he thought his second wife was the love of his life. And I don't know if that was a throwaway comment. I don't know if it was said in anger, but obviously that's got to be a bit of a sore spot for Bryn when it comes to something like that. And all of the demons and angst that she had and jealousy, not only of his career, but with everything else that was going on. If he could get a mulligan on that second marriage, and I really feel like to this day, that second wife too still has just as much love for him as he did for her.
I think she does. And I think that she was deeply hurt by the fact that, you know, a year into the relationship, I watched the last days of Phil Hartman that you were in. She talks about, you know, their first year of marriage was very difficult because he would pull away. And on their first anniversary, she was trying to be very romantic and, you know, lingerie to have a romantic weekend. And he was like, really? She was devastated. And she knew at that point, like, this is over.
A lot of people will say about him, no matter how long you knew him or how close you got to him, did you know the real him?
Thank you, Brian Mulhern. I'm going to wrap up this and call it part 1 of 2. You're a good man, Phil Hartman. With Brian Mulhern, my friend, colleague, comedy writer, radio host from Providence, Rhode Island. So, yeah, it does have some New England flavor, doesn't it? We make reference to The Last Days of Phil Hartman, an ABC special from 2019, 20 years after his death. And the book You Might Remember Me, The Life and Times of Phil Hartman by Mike Thomas. The new song I've been featuring, Where the Bodies Lay by Mello Bravo from Boston, Massachusetts. Going out with not a whole lot of fanfare this week, crimeofthetruestkind.com. There's a brand new merch store, links at the website. Follow the show at Crime of the Truest Kind, at Truest Kind on Twitter. Support the show, come back and listen to part 2. You're a good man, Phil Hartman, coming up next week. Thanks for listening. Oh yeah, lock your goddamn doors.